Hello everyone. Before we start, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment with where you from and what time it is. That way, YouTube will keep pulling you stories like this. Now, let the shadows take over. I've been a yard sale person my whole life. Not thrift stores, not antique shops. Yard sales. There's a difference. Thrift stores are already picked over. Antique shops price everything like it's a museum piece, but yard sales are raw. They're straight from someone's attic or basement, the dust still clinging to them, sometimes the smell too, and sometimes other things. My mom's the one who got me into it. Every Saturday morning when I was a kid, she'd load me into the passenger seat of her Buick with a coffee in her thermos and a juice box for me, and we'd go hunting. She'd follow those neon poster board signs stapled to telephone poles and taped to mailboxes, seeing what treasures the day would bring. She used to say, "You can tell more about a person by what they throw away than by what they keep." I didn't get it back then. Now at 34, living alone in Wilmington, North Carolina, I do. I work at a small independent bookstore, which is a poetic way of saying I don't make much money. Yard sales are my version of retail therapy, and honestly, sometimes they're the highlight of my week. I'm out there most weekends, rain or shine, mapping a route and hitting as many as I can before noon. Late April in Wilmington is perfect for it. Cool enough to walk around without sweating through your shirt, warm enough that people don't mind sitting outside all morning. That Saturday, I'd already been to 2 sales. The first was nothing but baby clothes and old board games with half the pieces missing. The second was a bunch of college kids trying to get rid of furniture that looked like it had survived a hurricane. I was about to call it quits when I spotted the sign. It was nailed to a telephone pole at the corner of a quiet street I'd never been down before. Yard sale. Today only. 214 Rosemont Ave. The letters were hand-painted in thick black strokes, the cardboard edges crisp and clean like it had been made that morning. Rosemont was lined with small, older homes, some freshly painted, others sagging from years of neglect. Number 214 had a white picket fence missing a couple of slats, grass high enough to hide your shoes, and a driveway cracked like dry riverbeds. Folding tables were scattered across it, and open boxes spilled their contents onto the gravel. A woman stood near the porch in a faded floral dress and a wide-brimmed straw hat that shaded most of her face. I got out of my car, gave her a polite "morning," and got the smallest nod in return. No smile. No. Everything's priced to sell, like you usually hear at these things. Just watching. The tables were a mix of the usual and the strange. A crate of brass keys, all unlabeled and clinking softly when you touched them. A box of kitchen utensils so old they belonged in a museum. Stacks of water-stained books. Framed paintings whose subjects had been bleached almost white by sunlight. On one table I saw a tin music box shaped like a carousel. I wound it out of curiosity, and it played for maybe 3 seconds before stopping dead. Then I noticed the milk crate under the corner table. It was full of dolls and stuffed animals, most of them dirty, missing eyes, or with hair worn down to the cloth. But one stood out. She was porcelain, about 18 inches tall, dressed in a pale blue Victorian-style dress with yellowed lace trim. Her golden ringlet hair was dusty but intact. Her face was what stopped me. Porcelain dolls usually have a neutral, pleasant stare. This one didn't. The tiny mouth was turned down slightly, the eyebrows tilted inward in judgment. Her glass eyes were a cloudy gray blue, not vibrant or shiny, but dull in a way that somehow still looked alive. I picked her up. She was heavier than I expected. The faint smell of mothballs clung to her dress, mixed with something older, like the inside of a trunk that hadn't been opened in decades. A piece of twine was tied around her wrist, holding a small tag. $3. I don't collect dolls. Never have. But I bought her anyway. When I handed her to the woman, she stared at the doll for a moment before taking my money. Then she said, "You be careful with that one." I chuckled. "Why? Is she haunted? Her tone didn't change. Just keep her somewhere she can't see you while you sleep. I waited for her to smile or wink. She didn't. She just handed me my change and turned away. The words followed me back to my car. I buckled the doll into the passenger seat. I don't even know why, and drove home. A couple of times I glanced over and thought her head had shifted slightly. I told myself it was just the bumps in the road. When I got home, I put her on the highest shelf of my bookcase, angled toward the window so she wasn't looking at me. By the time I'd made lunch and started a load of laundry, I'd forgotten she was even there. That night I woke up to a faint tapping sound. 2 taps, a pause, 2 taps again. My first thought was Moxie, my cat, pawing at something. I got up, padded into the living room, and froze. The doll was sitting on the windowsill, legs dangling over the edge, one porcelain hand pressed to the glass. I stood there for a good 10 seconds before moving. I told myself she must have fallen from the shelf and landed there somehow. I put her back, trying to ignore how deliberate the placement had looked. The next night I woke to the sound of Moxie hissing. It wasn't a playful hiss. It was deep and ugly. When I turned on the lamp, she was crouched low, tail puffed, glaring toward the open bedroom door. I followed her gaze. The doll was in the hallway, sitting upright on the floor, facing my door. I picked her up, my hands clammy, and shoved her into the hall closet. Top shelf, behind a pile of blankets. Out of sight. For 3 nights, nothing happened. Then I woke to a soft, clicking sound, like the pull chain on my standing lamp. I went into the living room, and the lamp was on. Under its light, perfectly centered on the couch cushion, was the doll. Her head was angled slightly toward the hallway like she'd been waiting for me to appear. I put her back in the closet and shut the door hard enough to make the frame rattle. During the day, I started feeling watched. Cooking in the kitchen, folding laundry, even in the shower. It was like there was a pair of eyes on me. Moxie stopped going anywhere near the closet. One afternoon, my friend Jess came over. As soon as she walked in, she wrinkled her nose. "What's that smell? Like old fabric?" I shrugged it off. We were talking in the living room when she stopped mid-sentence, staring past me. "Why is your doll's head turned like that?" I didn't answer. That night I woke to a scraping sound, porcelain against wood. I opened the closet and she was sitting on the floor directly in front of the door, like she'd been leaning on it from the inside. I left her there and shut the door. A few nights later, I woke to breathing. Not mine. Slow, deliberate. In the bedroom. When my eyes adjusted, I saw her, standing beside the bed. Her cloudy eyes were level with my face. Her head tilted slightly before I lunged out of bed, grabbed her by the dress, and ran to the kitchen. I wrapped her in 2 garbage bags, duct taped them shut, and drove her to the thrift store drop bin at 3:30 in the morning. 2 weeks later, I was walking past that store. In the display window was the doll. Same blue dress, same gray-blue eyes, and angled just enough to be looking right at me. I've been to hundreds of yard sales in my life, maybe more. I don't go looking for anything in particular. I just like the surprise of it. Sometimes it's nothing but boxes of VHS tapes and chipped mugs. Other times it's something that stops you in your tracks. I've found working cameras from the 60s, paintings signed by artists no one's ever heard of, even an old jukebox once for $50. Most of it I end up reselling, but every so often I'll find something I keep just because it's interesting. This time I brought home something I wish I'd never touched. It was a Saturday morning last July. Already hot enough by 8 that the air felt heavy, the kind of morning where you know it's going to be miserable by noon. The cicadas were screaming, the sound rolling over the neighborhood in waves. I was driving through the north end of town when I saw a handwritten sign nailed to a tree. Yard sale. 1 day only. 95 Broadwell Lane. The arrow pointed down a narrow road shaded by big old oaks. The house at 95 Broadwell was an old brick two-story with a wraparound porch and peeling white shutters. The driveway was long and cracked, weeds growing up between the slabs, and both sides were lined with tables piled high with the usual yard sale clutter. Stacks of paperback books, mismatched dishes, tools scattered across old towels. I was halfway down the drive when I saw it. Sitting right at the edge where the gravel met the grass was an old trunk. The kind you see in black and white photos of steamships, with curved edges, iron bands, and tarnished brass buckles. The leather was cracked and faded to a muddy brown, and there were brittle shipping labels clinging to the side. One of them had a date, faded but still readable, 1923. The latch was closed with a heavy padlock, thick enough to take serious effort to cut through. I crouched down to get a better look. The metal was pitted with rust, but the lock still looked solid. The wood around the latch was worn smooth, like it had been handled a lot over the years. Across the lid, I noticed deep scratches, long parallel grooves, as if something sharp had been dragged over it again and again. $30 if you can haul it, a voice said. I turned. The woman running the sale was in her 50s, wearing cut-off denim shorts and a faded tank top. Her hair was pulled up in a messy bun. She came closer, wiping her hands on the front of her shorts, and nodded toward the trunk. "Does it open?" I asked. She shook her head. "Not without the key, and I don't have it. Been locked since I got it." "What's in it?" Her eyes flicked to the trunk and back to me. Could be nothing. Could be clothes. Could be trash. All I know is, I'm tired of looking at it. The way she said it made me feel like there was more to that story, but I didn't push. For $30, I figured even if it was empty, it was a cool piece to have. I handed her the money, and she called over a guy from the garage to help load it into my SUV. It was heavy. The two of us had to stop halfway down the drive to set it on the ground and catch our breath. When we finally got it into the back, I noticed the smell. Faint at first. Stale. A little metallic. Maybe just the scent of old leather. I told myself it would air out once I got it home. I parked in my usual spot, hauled it inside, and set it against the living room wall next to my bookcase. I didn't have bolt cutters or the patience to mess with it right then, so I figured I'd make it a project for later in the week. That night I woke up to a sound I couldn't place. It was soft, irregular, a dull thump, then a pause, then the faint scrape of wood against wood. I sat up in bed and listened. The sound was coming from the living room. When I walked in, the trunk was angled slightly away from the wall. I was sure I'd set it flush. My cat, Maisie, was curled up asleep in the armchair, so it wasn't her. I pushed it back and went to bed, telling myself I was imagining things. The next night I woke to the same noise, a thump, a scrape, and then silence. I stood in the hallway watching. Nothing moved. But when I went closer, I caught it again, a faint knock from inside the trunk. 3 slow raps. My skin prickled, but I told myself it was just the wood settling. Old furniture makes noises, right? Still, I kept my distance and went back to bed. By the third night, the smell was stronger. Not just musty anymore, it had a sweet, rotten edge that made the back of my throat tighten. I lit a candle on the coffee table just to mask it. That night, the knocking woke me again, louder this time. 3 raps. Silence. Then the faint metallic rattle of the padlock, like it was shifting against the latch. Maisie was hiding under the bed, which she never did. I didn't go near the trunk. The next morning, I decided to open it. I borrowed bolt cutters from my neighbor and brought them inside. As soon as I crouched in front of the trunk, the air felt heavier, thicker. I slid the blades around the shank of the lock, and a dull pressure bloomed in my temples, the beginning of a headache. I stopped. I don't know why, but I couldn't bring myself to cut it. Over the next few days, it started to feel like the trunk was closer. I'd leave for work with it against the wall, and when I came home it would be an inch or two forward. I convinced myself it was my imagination, but the smell kept getting stronger, seeping into the upholstery of my couch. One afternoon, my friend Sarah came over. The moment she stepped inside, she stopped. "What is that smell?" she asked. I shrugged. "Old furniture, I guess." Her eyes landed on the trunk. "That thing? You need to get rid of it." That night, I dreamed about it. In the dream, I was sitting in front of the trunk in the dark. The lock was gone, and the lid was slowly lifting. Something inside was breathing. Slow, wet breaths that came with a faint clicking, like teeth tapping together. I woke up drenched in sweat and heard the metallic rattle of the lock in the living room. When I went to check in the morning, the lock was on the floor, closed, but somehow no longer attached to the latch. I didn't open the trunk. I told myself I'd just toss it out. 2 nights later, I woke to a crash. I ran into the living room and the trunk was on its side. The lid was hanging open an inch. The smell hit me so hard I gagged. The lining inside was shredded, strips of fabric hanging loose, and deep gouges scored into the wood at the bottom. I slammed it shut, dragged it to the curb, and left it there. That night, I heard the knocking again. Only this time, it was coming from inside my bedroom wall. Before we jump into the next story, if you're enjoying these creepy tales, hit that subscribe button. We have got fresh horror chills waiting for you every night. I've been to some strange yard sales in my time, but this one still gets to me. It started out like any other Saturday morning. The air was humid but not unbearable, and there was that faint smell of fresh-cut grass drifting through the open window of my car. I'd already been to a couple of sales. One in a church parking lot that was all costume jewelry and crockpots, and another at a little brick house where the best find was a stack of old cookbooks. I was about ready to head home when I saw it. A sign propped against a telephone pole at the edge of town. It wasn't the usual neon poster board with bubble letters. It was a piece of plywood, painted white, with yard sale written in blocky black stenciled letters. Below it, an arrow pointed down a narrow gravel road that disappeared into the trees. Normally, I stick to the main streets. There's safety in numbers, and most yard sales are easy to find. But something about that sign, maybe it was the way it looked deliberate, like it had been made to last. Or maybe I was just curious to see who would go to the trouble of painting a yard sale sign instead of scribbling one with a marker. I slowed down, checked my phone for signal, 1 bar, and turned onto the gravel road. The farther I drove, the denser the trees became. The road was just wide enough for my car, and the canopy above blocked most of the sunlight. I kept going, half expecting to see another sign or some balloons to let me know I was on the right track, but there was nothing. Just trees, and that thin ribbon of gravel. Finally, after what felt like too long, the road opened up into a small clearing. Off to the right was a weathered wooden shed with a sagging roof and peeling paint. In front of it were 3 folding tables covered in random items and a few milk crates on the ground. There were no other cars, no other people browsing, just a man sitting in a metal lawn chair behind one of the tables. He looked to be in his late 60s, tall and thin, with a long face and skin tanned to the color of leather. He wore a faded blue work shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and a ball cap that looked older than I was. When I pulled up, he didn't wave or smile, just watched me with this steady, unreadable expression. I got out of my car trying to act casual. "Morning," I said. "Morning," he replied, his voice low and gravelly. The tables were a mess of odd items. A mason jar full of mismatched keys. A stack of framed photographs of people I didn't know. Some in color, some black and white, all without frames. Old boots, a pocket knife with a cracked handle, several watches stopped at different times. Nothing was priced. "You get all this from estate sales?" I asked, picking up a brass lighter with initials engraved on it. The man shook his head slowly. "Clean out abandoned places," he said. "People leave things behind. I sell them." Something about the way he said it made the hairs on my arms stand up. I moved to the last table. On it was an old camcorder, the kind from the early 2000s that recorded on mini-tapes. The rubber grip was worn smooth and there was dust in the buttons, but it felt solid when I picked it up. I flipped open the tape compartment. There was a cassette still inside. "How much for the camera?" I asked. He tilted his head. $10. I handed him the money. He took it without counting, eyes fixed on the camcorder like he was thinking about something. "You want the tape with it?" he asked. I laughed lightly. "Sure. Why not?" He didn't laugh back. I thanked him and walked back to my car. As I was getting in, I glanced back. He was still watching me, one hand resting on his knee, the other hanging limp at his side. Back home, I set the camcorder on the kitchen counter and made lunch. Part of me figured the tape would just be old family videos, birthday parties, maybe a graduation. Still, I was curious enough to dig out my adapter so I could play it through the TV. When I pressed play, the screen stayed black for a moment before flickering to life. The footage was shaky, like the person holding it was breathing hard. The first thing I saw was the inside of a house, not mine, but furnished in a way that felt lived in. The camera moved slowly down a hallway, pausing on photographs hanging on the wall. They were all slightly blurred, like the camera operator didn't quite focus before moving on. There was no sound except for a faint hiss from the tape. The next shot was of a bedroom, the camera lingering on the bed for several long seconds before tilting up to a dresser. On top of it was a jewelry box closed. The camera stayed there almost too long before cutting out. The footage jumped to a kitchen, then a back porch, then another bedroom. None of the shots showed any people. I was starting to think it was just some weird artsy thing someone had filmed in an empty house when the next cut made my stomach drop. It was my street. The camera was pointed through the windshield of a car, slowly rolling past my house. You could see my front porch, the light fixture by the door, even the dent in the mailbox post where a delivery truck had clipped it last year. The next cut was inside my house, my living room. The shot was from the corner near the ceiling, like the camera had been placed on top of a bookshelf. The frame was still for nearly a full minute before the person behind it picked it up and moved through the room. The footage went down my hallway, into my bedroom. The camera lingered on my bed, my nightstand, the glass of water I'd left there the night before. I paused the tape, my hands shaking. I didn't remember locking my door when I went to the yard sale, but I always locked it before bed. Always. I debated calling the police right then, but part of me wanted to see the rest, like maybe there was some explanation. A break-in from years ago I'd never heard about, something that didn't involve someone still having access to my home. I pressed play again. The footage cut to the outside of my house at night. The blinds in my bedroom window were partially open, and you could see me asleep in bed. My chest felt tight. The person filming zoomed in slowly, holding the shot until the tape went to static. I hit stop. I was breathing fast, my palms slick. Then, from the living room, I heard a faint mechanical whirring. The camcorder was on. Its red recording light was glowing. I hadn't touched it. I unplugged the TV and backed toward the door, my eyes on the camera. The whirring stopped. Somewhere outside, in the woods behind my building, I thought I heard footsteps. I've been to a lot of yard sales in my life, but I've never walked away from one with something that would change how I felt in my own home forever. It was a Saturday morning in early September, one of those days where the air still carried the tail end of summer warmth, but you could smell autumn creeping in. I'd been driving around town with a thermos of coffee, hitting random sales just to see if I could find anything interesting. The one I'm talking about was in a quiet, older neighborhood on the edge of town. The kind of place where the houses all had wide porches, big shady trees, and lawns that looked like they'd been cared for by the same family for decades. There was a handwritten sign taped to a lamppost. Estate sale. Everything must go. Those words always made me curious. Estate sales usually meant someone had passed away, and the family was selling off the belongings. I parked across the street, took a sip of my coffee, and walked up the driveway. It was different from the usual weekend sale. There was no music playing, no folding tables covered in junk, no kids running around with lemonade stands. Just a few pieces of furniture out front and a woman in her late 20s or early 30s sitting on the porch with a cash box in her lap. Her eyes looked tired, like she hadn't slept in days. I gave her a polite nod and she tried to smile back. Inside, the house felt heavy. Not dirty, not neglected. Just heavy. Like the walls themselves had soaked up decades of memories and weren't ready to let go. Every step I took made the hardwood creak, and the air smelled faintly of lavender and something older, something musty. That's when I saw it. On a small table in the living room, sitting alone, was a wooden music box. It wasn't flashy. Medium-sized, dark cherry wood, a little worn at the edges. There was a delicate brass key sticking out from the back and a faint etching of flowers along the lid. I picked it up and it was heavier than it looked. I turned the key once, twice, and the box began to play the softest, sweetest little melody. I didn't recognize it, but for some reason, it made my chest ache. It reminded me of my mom. She used to hum something similar when I was a kid, usually when she was tucking me in at night. She's been gone for years now, but hearing that tune brought her back in a way that hit me harder than I expected. Pretty, isn't it? The voice startled me. It was the woman from the porch, now standing in the doorway watching me. It was my grandmother's, she said. She used to play it every night before bed. Even after she couldn't walk anymore, she'd have me wind it for her. Said she couldn't sleep without it. I told her it reminded me of my mom. She nodded, but then her expression shifted just slightly. It still works fine, she said, but sometimes it plays on its own. She laughed a little, but it wasn't the kind of laugh that comes from finding something funny. More like she was trying to make light of something that bothered her. I didn't think much of it. Music boxes are old. Maybe a spring slips sometimes. I paid her $10 and left with it, tucking it carefully into my back seat. The first night, I put the music box on the dresser in my bedroom. I wound it once before bed, listening to the tune as I lay under the covers. It was comforting in a way. That soft lullaby drifting through the room made me feel less alone. I fell asleep before it stopped playing. But at around 3 in the morning I woke up. No reason. I just opened my eyes and stared into the dark for a moment. And then I heard it. That same melody, playing again. I reached over and turned on the lamp. The music box was sitting there, lid closed, but the song was coming from it. Clear as day. I watched it until the last note faded. The key in the back was still, like it hadn't been wound at all. I told myself it was probably just leftover tension in the mechanism, a weird quirk. But when I reached out to touch it, the wood felt ice cold. The next night, I decided not to wind it at all. I left it untouched, closed, on the dresser. Around 2:30 I woke again, this time because I thought I heard whispering. At first I figured it was a dream, but then the music started. Same song, same volume, just as clear as before. This time I sat up and just listened. And I swear, underneath the notes I could hear something. A soft, muffled crying. Not loud, like someone trying not to be heard. The air in the room felt heavy, and the hairs on my arms stood on end. I got up, picked up the music box and carried it into the living room. I left it there on the coffee table, figuring maybe if it wanted to play itself again, it could do it as far away from me as possible. 2 nights later, it got worse. I woke at almost the same time, 3:12 a.m., to find the music box sitting on my nightstand. I live alone. I hadn't touched it since moving it to the living room. It wasn't playing when I saw it, but the lid was open. I remember just staring at it, my heart pounding in my ears until I finally slammed the lid shut and shoved it into the closet. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next day, I decided to look into the house where I bought it. Turns out the woman who owned it, the grandmother, had died earlier that summer. But before that, back in the 1970s, she'd lost a child. A little boy, only 5 years old, drowned in the creek behind their property. Neighbors said she never got over it, played that music box every night, humming along through her tears. That night I had every intention of leaving it in the closet. But around 3 a.m., I woke again, and the song was playing. Only this time it was right next to my ear. I turned my head slowly, and there it was, sitting on the pillow beside me. My whole body went cold. I could feel something, a weight, on the bed behind me. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't not look. I turned over and saw a figure curled up on the other side of the bed, small, child-sized. The music kept playing, and the figure shifted slightly, like it was breathing. I couldn't move, couldn't even speak. And then, so softly I almost didn't hear it, a woman's voice whispered, "It's time to sleep now." I don't remember deciding to close my eyes. I just remember waking up in the morning, the box back on the dresser. I couldn't keep it. I drove back to that neighborhood intending to give it to the granddaughter. She was sitting on the porch again, and when she saw me, her eyes went wide. Before I could even explain, she said, "It played for you, didn't it?" I just nodded and handed it to her. She took it, staring down at the wood like she was seeing someone she missed. "She's just lonely," she said quietly. "She probably thought you were him." I didn't know what to say. I got in my car and drove home. That night, my bedroom felt emptier than it had in a long time. I didn't sleep much, but at some point I thought I heard that faint melody again. Not in my room, not in the house, just far away, like someone was humming it to a child. And for the first time in days, the thought didn't scare me, it just made my chest ache. It was a Saturday morning in late October, the kind of gray, wind-cut morning where the air smells like wet leaves and the clouds hang low enough to touch. I'd been driving back from the farmer's market when I saw the crooked, hand-painted sign stuck into the damp ground at the end of a long gravel driveway. Yard sale. All items must go. The paint looked fresh, but the board was warped and splintered, like it had been lying in a shed for years before someone decided to use it again. I don't usually stop for yard sales, but something about that sign, the way it seemed almost desperate, caught my attention. Maybe it was the phrasing. All items must go. It felt less like a cheerful invitation and more like a warning. The driveway was long, cutting through an overgrown stretch of property where weeds had swallowed the fence and the trees leaned inward like they were hiding something. The gravel crunched under my tires in a way that made me feel uncomfortably loud. At the top, the house appeared, a sagging two-story structure with faded green paint and warped shutters. The porch was littered with mismatched tables stacked with items, old clocks, chipped mugs, cracked picture frames, boxes of clothes that smelled faintly of mildew even from a distance. There was no one else there, no browsing customers, no sign of a crowd. Just a single figure sitting in a rocking chair at the far end of the porch, moving so slowly that for a moment I thought they might be asleep. As I got out of the car, the figure lifted their head. It was a man, thin to the point of looking brittle, his skin pale and stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. His eyes were a washed-out blue, glassy like marbles, and his lips barely moved when he spoke. "Mornin'," he rasped, though it came out flat, more like an echo of a greeting than the real thing. His voice had that strange quality, as if it had been disused for years. I returned the greeting and stepped onto the porch, the boards groaning under my weight. He didn't get up or gesture toward the items, just kept watching me. I started browsing the tables, trying to ignore the way his stare pressed into me. Most of the items were strange in that they didn't seem like the usual mix from a house clear-out. Instead, they felt curated. The clocks were all stopped at exactly 3:17. Every photograph in the frames was of people looking away from the camera, their faces turned just enough to hide their eyes. The clothes were all black or dark gray, some with odd rips or stains that didn't look accidental. One item in particular caught my eye. A small wooden box, about the size of a shoebox, with intricate carvings on its surface. The carvings didn't look like any style I recognized. They twisted in looping, sharp patterns that made my head hurt if I stared too long. I reached for it, and the man's voice cut through the air like a blade. "That one's not for you." I froze, my hand inches from the box. "Sorry, I thought everything was for sale." His eyes narrowed just slightly. "Not that." Then he smiled, but it wasn't warm. It was the kind of smile that feels like a dare. "But if you're looking for something that'll stay with you, take the clock over there." I glanced at the clock he meant, an old brass alarm clock with 2 bells on top. Its glass face was cracked, and the hands pointed to 3:17 like the others, but I noticed something unsettling. Even though it wasn't ticking, the second hand twitched, just barely every few seconds. I told him I'd think about it and kept looking. That's when I realized the air smelled different now, heavier, like old smoke or the inside of a damp basement. The wind had died and the trees seemed unnaturally still. The longer I stayed, the more I noticed things that didn't fit. A doll with human hair sewn into its scalp. A stack of vinyl records with every label scratched off, leaving deep gouges that made the grooves look like scars. A jar of teeth. Human, unless I was imagining the shapes. I turned back toward the man, intending to leave, but he was no longer in the chair. My stomach dropped. He was standing behind the table nearest to me, closer than he had any right to be without me hearing him move. His eyes were fixed on mine now, and up close, I could see they weren't just pale, they were cloudy, as if there was something moving behind them. "You should buy something," he said quietly. "Everyone does." There was no smile this time, no trace of anything human in his expression. My instinct screamed at me to get off the porch, but before I could step back, I heard something from inside the house. A slow, deliberate knock, 3 times, steady and heavy like someone knocking from inside a wall. I froze, looking past him toward the front door, which was cracked open just enough to reveal the darkness inside. The knock came again, followed by a low, wet, dragging sound that seemed to move closer to the door. The man tilted his head slightly as if listening, then looked back at me. "She wants to see you." His voice was almost tender, like he was introducing me to an old friend. I took a step back, but he matched it, stepping forward without breaking eye contact. "If you leave without taking something, she'll come for you anyway." The dragging sound was at the threshold now. The darkness inside shifted like something huge and shapeless was just beyond sight. I caught a glimpse of pale fingers curling around the edge of the door. Too many fingers bending the wrong way. My breath caught in my throat. I bolted for the steps, practically leaping off the porch, but the man didn't follow. Instead, his voice followed me down the driveway, clear and steady despite the distance. "You'll be back. They always come back." I didn't look behind me until I was in my car, slamming the door and fumbling with the ignition. The house seemed smaller now, further away, but the front door was wide open. Something pale was standing just inside, motionless, watching. As I tore out of the driveway, the rear-view mirror showed me something that made my blood run cold. The man, still in his rocking chair, smiling at me like I had never moved at all. For the next week, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd brought something back with me. Little things started happening. The smell of damp smoke in my kitchen, my clocks, even my phone, freezing at 3:17. At night, I would wake up to the sound of slow, deliberate knocking somewhere inside my walls. 3 knocks, always 3. And when I turned toward my bedroom door, I could see it just barely cracked open, the dark on the other side, thicker than it should be. Sometimes I swear I see fingers curling around the edge. Too many fingers. I haven't gone back to that house, but I've started seeing more of those signs around town. Yard sale. All items must go. Same handwriting, same warped boards, each one pointing toward a different direction. I know if I follow any of them, I'll find him again. And maybe next time, I won't get away. I've always thought of myself as someone who could handle living alone. You get used to the creaks and groans of an empty house, the way shadows shift at night. But I also know now that once you've been watched, really watched, you can never go back to feeling safe again. It started on one of those blistering August afternoons where the heat makes the air ripple over the pavement. I'd been out running errands when I saw it, a weathered cardboard sign nailed crookedly to a telephone pole. Yard sale, everything must go, in big, shaky letters. The arrow pointed down a side street I'd never noticed before, even though I've lived in this town for 6 years. The street was narrow and shaded by overgrown oaks, their heavy branches knitting together to block most of the sunlight. I drove past leaning fences, yards littered with rusted bikes and lawn chairs, until I reached the last house, a squat single-story place with peeling paint and a driveway that sagged into cracked concrete. Tables and crates spilled across the lawn, but there was no cheerful chatter, no kids playing in the grass like most weekend sales. Just stillness, like the air itself had gone stale. The man behind the main table didn't look up when I parked. He was tall but hunched, his shoulders curved forward in a way that made his neck seem too long. His clothes were loose and outdated, a faded button-up and gray slacks that hung like they'd been made for someone else. His skin had the kind of waxy pallor you see in hospital patients who've been inside too long. When he finally lifted his gaze, I froze. His eyes weren't quite right. Not blind but cloudy like marbles with a thin film over them. I forced a smile and wandered the tables, trying to act normal. But everything laid out for sale had a strange weight to it, like it carried a memory it didn't want to let go of. A stack of black and white photographs, edges curled and stained, a cracked baby carriage with wheels that didn't match, a row of porcelain dolls whose glass eyes seemed to catch the light in the wrong way. Then I saw it. A picture frame, plain wood, slightly scratched. Inside was a photo of an unfamiliar 2-story house, old and leaning slightly, with a single window on the upper floor. Something pale hovered in that window, too faint to make out clearly, but enough to make the hairs on my arms rise. I don't know why, but I picked it up. "How much?" I asked. The man's lips twitched, not into a smile exactly, but into something that made my stomach knot. His voice was low and raspy, as if it hadn't been used in years. $3. I handed him a 5 and told him to keep the change. He didn't thank me. Instead, he slid the frame into a brown paper bag, holding it there for a moment before I could take it. His hand was cold, colder than it should have been in that heat. He leaned forward just enough that I caught the sour, damp smell of his breath. "Once it's yours," he murmured, "it stays yours." The words hit me wrong, too heavy for such a mundane exchange. I mumbled something and left fast, the image of those cloudy eyes still clinging to me. That evening, I dropped the bag on my kitchen counter and didn't look at it until later, when I was making dinner. The photograph inside was different now. The pale blur in the window was sharper and I could make out features. A gaunt face, eyes as cloudy and still as the seller's. I told myself it was my imagination, that maybe I just hadn't noticed the detail before. But deep down I knew that wasn't true. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. As I brushed my teeth, I glanced toward my bedroom window and froze. Through the half-open blinds, someone was standing on the sidewalk facing my house. Tall, slightly hunched, my skin prickled, my pulse thudding in my ears. I shut the blinds and told myself it was just a late-night walker. The next night, he was closer, standing at the edge of my front yard. The streetlight caught the faint outline of his face, and my chest tightened. I grabbed my phone, but when I looked back, he was gone. The security camera footage made my stomach drop. One frame showed an empty lawn. The very next, Less than a second later, he was standing there. No walking up, no movement at all. Just there. And when I paused it, his eyes seemed to find the lens. By the fourth night, I'd stopped sleeping deeply, waking at every sound. That was when I heard it. A faint tap. 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 Like fingernails on glass. My bedroom window. I turned slowly, every muscle tight. He was there. The cellar. Face inches from the glass, his mouth curling into that twitch of a smile. His breath fogged a small patch of the pain as his hand dragged slowly down, leaving a greasy smear. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. He stepped back and disappeared into the dark, swallowed whole like the night had been waiting for him. The police found nothing. No footprints, no fingerprints. My camera caught his face pressed against the glass. Too close. The shot so tight that I could see myself in the reflection of his eyes. Frozen in bed. It didn't stop. I'd see him at random times standing across the street, half hidden behind a tree. Once I spotted him in the reflection of my TV screen, though the window behind me showed nothing. I tried to get rid of the frame, drove it 20 miles away, and tossed it into a dumpster. The next morning, it was back on my counter. The photo had changed again. Now it was my house, my window, with me standing inside. That night I woke to the sound of my front door creaking open. I grabbed my phone, but it was dead, even though I'd left it charging. My breathing sounded too loud in my ears as I stepped into the hallway. The air was colder, heavy. He was standing in the living room, just standing there, his head tilted in that same strange way as when I first saw him. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. His lips parted, and I swear I heard that same rasp from the yard sale. Once it's yours, it stays yours. The lights flickered, and he was gone. I don't go outside much now. Doesn't matter. He's inside more often. I hear the tapping some nights. Sometimes it's at the window, sometimes at the bedroom door. And once I woke up to find the picture frame on my pillow. The photograph now shows me sleeping. And behind me, he's smiling. I'll never forget the first time I saw the place. Not because it was particularly beautiful or grand, but because something about it felt wrong in a way I couldn't quite put into words. It was one of those thick, late August afternoons in rural Pennsylvania, where the air itself seems heavy, a warm, wet blanket that makes your clothes stick to your skin. My sister Katie had roped me into her weekend ritual of hitting yard sales across the county, claiming I had a good eye for rare finds. I didn't, but she enjoyed having company, and I figured it was better than spending another Saturday scrolling aimlessly on my phone. We'd already been at it for hours, bouncing from cheerful suburban lawns covered in old toys and coffee-stained books to the occasional farmhouse selling rusted tools and dented pots. By the time the clock ticked past 3, my patience was wearing thin. Katie was still buzzing, her eyes darting to every neon poster board sign at every corner. But I was ready to head home. That's when she slowed the car, her attention caught by a hand-painted wooden arrow stuck into the ground at the edge of the road. Sale, it read, in uneven black letters that looked as though they'd been carved rather than painted. Last one, she said, already turning the wheel before I could answer. The arrow pointed us down a narrow lane I'd never noticed before, lined on both sides by towering sycamores whose branches tangled overhead like gnarled fingers, blotting out most of the sunlight. The deeper we drove, the more the neighborhood seemed to dissolve. The houses were older here, most of them dark and shuttered, some with boards nailed across the windows. Weeds had swallowed the yards, and mailboxes leaned drunkenly on rotting posts. There was no sound except for the steady crunch of gravel under the tires. The lane ended at a house that looked as though it had been dragged forward through time from another century. The siding was an unnatural gray, not the chipped, sun-faded paint of neglect, but a flat, colorless tone, as if every pigment had been drained out of it. The yard was dry dirt with patches of brittle grass, and in the center of the cracked driveway sat a single long folding table covered with objects. No price tags, no bright signs, no attempt to make anything look inviting. Just things. Katie was halfway out of the car before I'd even unbuckled my seatbelt. The items were a strange mix. Porcelain dolls with cracked faces, yellowed books stacked in precarious towers, tarnished silverware in velvet-lined cases, framed black and white photographs, jewelry boxes with broken clasps. There was also a cardboard box filled with loose photographs, the top few curling at the corners. That's when I saw him. He appeared from around the side of the house without a sound, and the suddenness of it made my stomach clench. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, and rail-thin, with posture so rigid it seemed unnatural. His long gray hair fell past his shoulders in uneven strands, framing a face so deeply lined it looked carved from wood. But it was his eyes that rooted me in place. Dark, not just in color, but in depth, as though the light could never touch the bottom. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice smooth but papery, the kind of sound that makes you think of dry leaves. Katie smiled, already asking him about the silverware. I wasn't listening. My attention was on the photographs in the cardboard box. They weren't family portraits or vacation shots. They were of people sleeping. Men, women, children, some alone, some in pairs. None of them looked peaceful. Their brows were furrowed, lips pressed or parted in subtle tension, as though they were dreaming of something unpleasant. And the angles, they were all taken up close. Too close. I picked up one photo, my pulse quickening. It was of a young woman in her 20s, lying on her side in bed, her face turned toward the camera. The image was so sharp you could make out the fine lines in her skin, even though the room's only light came from a street lamp outside the window. "Careful with that one," the man said suddenly, his eyes locking onto mine. "She was a light sleeper." I frowned. "What do you mean?" His lips curled in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Some people wake if you breathe too close. You have to learn to move slowly, carefully, if you don't want them to open their eyes." Katie gave a nervous laugh, assuming it was an offbeat joke. I put the photo back, feeling my skin crawl. Katie eventually bought the silverware. He didn't name a price, just told her, "Pay what it's worth to you." She left him a 20, which he accepted without looking down, his long fingers lingering against hers for a second too long. As we walked back to the car, I glanced over my shoulder. He was still there, watching us, head tilted ever so slightly like he was listening to something only he could hear. That night, Katie called me. She was rattled. While cleaning the silverware, she'd noticed the velvet lining in the case was loose. When she pulled it back, she found a photograph taped underneath. It was in color this time. It was of her, sleeping in her bed. I told her to pack a bag and come to my place. She agreed. 20 minutes later, she called again, her voice shaking. There was a beat-up blue pickup following her, matching her speed, slowing when she slowed. I told her not to stop, to just keep driving straight to me. Halfway through the call, I heard a sharp thud, like the phone hitting the floor, followed by silence. I called her over and over, no answer. When I reached her apartment complex, her car was in the lot, engine running, driver's door open. The silverware case was on the passenger seat. The photograph was gone. The police searched, but there was no sign of her. No witnesses. When I gave them the address of the yard sale, they said the property had been vacant for over 20 years. I went back the next day. The table was gone. The yard was empty. The windows were boarded from the inside. I knocked until my knuckles ached, but no one came. That night, I woke to the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps in my apartment. I grabbed a bat and checked every room. Nothing. The second night, I woke to find my bedroom door open. I always shut it. The third night, there was a photograph on my nightstand. Black and white. Me, sleeping. I burned it in the sink. In the morning, it was back. The noises grew louder. Breathing at the foot of my bed. The whisper of fabric as if someone were shifting their weight. Sometimes I felt the mattress dip beside me. Then, one night I woke to find the silverware case on my kitchen table. Inside was a new photograph, Katie standing in a dark room, eyes wide and lifeless. Behind her, barely visible in the shadows, was the man. That's when it clicked. The yard sale wasn't about money. Each item was a carrier, a link. When you bought one, you didn't just take home an object. You took home the presence tied to it. And when your time was up, you became the next presence. I'm not sure how much time I have left. Last night I woke to find him in the corner of my bedroom holding my photograph.